You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Dr. Jennifer Kent, Senior Research Fellow in Urbanism at the Sydney School of Architecture. Jennifer talks with us about why we travel, the impacts of dogs on our travel behavior, and the idea of messy trips. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting each month. And if you are a Patreon supporter, we just posted bonus materials at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've started doing more bonus materials that enhance the initial episode, so check them out if you're a supporter. And if you're not a Patreon supporter and wish to join our merry band of transportation nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and you'll get a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month and you'll get our bus-only scarf. Appreciate everyone that has supported and continues to support the show. And for a free trial of our 15-year-old Daily Cities newsletter, or for access to our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning and Practice, go to theoverheadwire.com. Our newsletter is the oldest and the best in the business because we share information about what everyone else is doing. So check it out if you get a chance, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Well, Jennifer Kent, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Hi.
Well, you're currently, as we like to say in the future, what time is it in Australia right now?
It's 10 o'clock in the morning, Friday morning.
Oh, so it's not too bad, but it's your Friday. You must be really excited about that.
Yeah, although we're currently in lockdown here in Sydney, so our weekend is looking remarkably boring.
Well, I guess it's still a weekend, though. I mean, when we were in quarantine, I was still looking forward to lockdown weekends, too. So
Yeah.
It made me get away from my computer and things like that. Watch a few good TV shows.
That's true. It's true.
Well, thanks for coming on and thanks for reaching out on such an important topic, which we'll discuss in a bit. But before we get started with that, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for having me and thank you for your interest in my research. So my name is Dr. Jennifer Kent. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in Urbanism or Urban Planning at the University of Sydney. I've been at the University of Sydney since 2015 after I did my PhD, which was all focusing on the links between transport, health, and urban planning, trying to, I guess, ostensibly unpick the links between private car use and health in particular.
And what got you interested in cities and urbanism? Was it from something that happened when you were a little kid, or was it something that you learned when you were in school, or how did you come about the subject?
Good question. So I started out with my tertiary studies doing environmental science and pretty soon realised that I was missing people. So I started to look more towards the environmental management side of things and human geography. But at the same time, I was actually a professional cyclist. So I was racing bikes all over Europe and in the US. And just through that experience, I suppose, once you experience things from a bike in such a really embodied kind of a way, you start to get more of an appreciation for roads and city structure and that kind of thing, and notice the nuance of difference that is across cities around the world. But you also get to notice the nuance of difference in the communities that are hosting your racing and the communities that you race with and so forth. So when I decided to retire from cycling, I started to look towards urban planning as a profession.
That's awesome. I mean, I ran cross country and track in high school and college and a tiny bit professionally afterwards, a tiny bit. But one of the things that I found was that really spurred my interest in cities as well. I mean, I knew all of Austin, which is where I went to school, within a 10-mile radius of downtown because of all of my running. I knew every street and I knew every block and I knew all these places. And it kind of fits that idea of the bike and the pedestrian experience. If you experience it more, like as a cyclist, as you were, a professional no less, it gets a little bit different, I think, in people's minds than if you just kind of saw it out the window of a car or you were speeding past. Life comes at you a little slower, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. And you get that real immersion that comes with, the smells and the sounds and the tiny intricacies of details of the sites that you see as well. I remember having, a really good knowledge of the cracks in the roadway that I would cycle on and that kind of thing. And somehow that connects really well with being able to have an appreciation for urban form and the way that can really impact people's lives.
Now you're retired. Do you still watch cycling on television? I mean, the tour is happening right now, obviously. And are you still into that big time?
Oh, not so much. My husband is. He still races bikes, and it's on here at like 12:30 in the morning. So occasionally I catch him watching it, and then I wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, what happened in the tour?" And we're both so amazed that Mark Cavendish is, winning a couple of stages. It's amazing. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. Well, so you focus a lot on how families travel in your research, but how did you initially come to that topic specifically?
Well, I'm really interested in, I guess, exploring the concept of derived demand for travel, but in a really deep and sort of sociological way. So we all know that transport is a metaphor, right? And I'm not the first person to have said that. Even from the etymology of the word, transport and metaphor mean the same thing, to carry across. So when we're traveling somewhere, we're not traveling somewhere, we're practicing the thing that we're trying to obtain by doing that travel. So I always use the example of traveling to a children's birthday party. In Sydney, we have this huge problem with weekend traffic at the moment, and a lot of that is to do with the transport of families, the transport practices of families. And I say to transport researchers, when a dad is driving his daughter across town to go to a child's birthday party, he's not driving his daughter, he's being a good parent. He's socializing his daughter, he's getting ideas for her next birthday party, he's meeting with other parents, he's networking. These are all the things that he's accomplishing through that trip. It's got nothing to do with, for him, with the drive itself. So I'm super interested in all those tiny details of what actually motivates our transport trips, and conceptualizing the demand for transport as a demand for those things rather than demand for transport in itself. So that kind of brought me to travel with families, because travel with families is a highly emotive process for a lot of people. All sort of journeys associated with care seem to be. And in that context, we very readily start to make decisions that are perhaps less in the interests of sustainability or of the wider community or even of our own personal health. And we prioritise the need to perform, familial duties, perform the duty of care. And so that sort of changes, I suppose, the way that we make travel decisions. So that's what brought me to families.
That's so interesting. We're going to talk about travel and dogs in a second, but part of the response to an earlier piece that you wrote, the responses were very emotional. People's, objections or pros for having pets on transport. But I feel like, you talk about that emotional connection too. And I feel like there's also a very emotional connection when you try to talk to people about how their travel affects maybe a greater society, and they get emotional about that too. And you mentioned that briefly, and you said the word emotive. I'm wondering how those things are connected, the emotions of it all versus maybe that just kind of disconnected need to, serve a greater good.
Yeah, well, I mean, in transport research, there is sort of this big body of research that looks at psychosocial motivators for travel. So it looks at things like the way that our travel is wrapped up in our identity, and the way that our travel is wrapped up in our pursuit of a social norm and that kind of thing. I think my point is that it's not our travel that is wrapped up in our identity, but the things that we're trying to accomplish through travel that is wrapped up in our identity. Obviously, there's certain segments, and I think cycling is quite an obvious one, where people do identify quite strongly as being a cyclist. And in some sections of society, there's still people who will identify very strongly with being a car driver or a truck driver or a driver of a certain type of car. But generally in Australia, perhaps a little bit less in the US, I'm not quite sure. The US is so polarised in so many ways, hard to make generalisations. Generally in Australia, we don't find people are wrapped up in the identity of their car so much anymore. I think that we've sort of surpassed that as the generations have gone through. But we're definitely still attached to being a certain type of person and making a certain type of lifestyle work that may be car dependent. So it's, I guess, just another leap from what the traditional transport research is looked at in terms of emotions and psychosocial connections between transport and the way that we travel.
That's so interesting. I feel like sometimes here in the US, at least, I think, there is a conflation between that need to travel and how you travel. And the connection to the open road or automobiles generally is pretty strong. Growing up in Houston, on the outskirts of Houston, I had access to a car when I was 16, and that's how I got around. Even though there were good bike trails and stuff where I was, biking was still something that you could do when you were younger. And even when you were older, in the neighborhood that I was in, but everywhere else, if you wanted to get outside of that neighborhood, you had to use the car. So I think that connection is there, meant your ultimate freedom, even though maybe it shouldn't have.
Yeah, I mean, the freedom and autonomy, I think the privacy is also an important thing for people in terms of the sort of psychosocial or emotional things that they experience with the car. Some of my original work looked at those sort of concepts in the conceptualization of ontological security, which is sort of the way that we see ourselves in the world. And I was able to demonstrate through interviews with people that these three concepts of privacy, autonomy, and flexibility were just so integral to people's way of operating in the world, to their ways of working, their ways of caring, their ways of socializing and self-care, all of those things. And in the city that they were living in, which is Sydney, a hugely car-dependent city, the only way that they could obtain those things was through private car use. So I just think in transport, we gloss over and sort of underestimate the depth of those connections and how, deeply rooted they are in our sense of being, not necessarily because we're all car addicts or nerds or love cars or anything like that. It's because we love the lifestyle that we have, or the lifestyle that we have works for us. And to make that work, we need the car.
Do you think that's driving some of the discussion throughout the pandemic of this kind of move towards telecommuting or work from home as well? I mean, if some of the items that you mentioned as being connected to that, the independence of it all, do you think that's connected too? It's not just obviously a transport thing, but it feels like maybe it's a work thing, or maybe it's just, like you said, general life, the lifestyle, I guess, of it all.
Yeah, perhaps. I hadn't really thought about it in the context of the pandemic, but when you think about it, I mean, that ability to work from home, what we want is the choice, don't we? We don't necessarily want to work from home. We want to be able to run the ship, and say where we're going to be and when we're going to be there. And it's the same with everything. We want to be able to choose whether we're going to buy our groceries online this week or go to the supermarket a few times. We want to be able to choose which school we send our child to. We want to be able to choose which gym we go to. That openness of choice and decision-making is seen by a lot of people as, the draw card of living in a city. That's what you have access to, all those opportunities. And so when we think about transport as just a derived demand and try to design these, 20-minute neighborhoods where we provide everybody with access to a supermarket, access to a school, access to some medical care, we totally just disregard the fact that people don't want to go to that particular supermarket all the time. They want to choose which supermarket they go to. And if that supermarket happens to be 40 minutes across town, they're going to go there if they've got the time to do it.
Right.
So that access to choice, I think, and ability to choose is something we also underestimate.
Yeah, we had Alex Hoffman on recently from the city of El Paso, and he talked about that to a certain extent was, the data is showing you that even in a 30-minute neighborhood or a 20-minute neighborhood or whichever time limit we want to give on our neighborhoods these days, there might be an ethnic component, right? And you might not want to go to that Whole Foods, or there might be an equity component. You might not go to that restaurant because it's expensive. Even if you do have access to it, you're not going to go there. You're going to go to the place where you feel comfortable or where you want to visit. And so that's an interesting connection to all this as well. Yeah.
And I mean, that is like that kind of detail is what gets me up in the morning and keeps me awake at night as a transport researcher, is just thinking, gosh, you look at the data and you look at that trip chaining behavior that you're seeing in that data and you think, what on earth was going on for that woman? And it could be anything. It could be her toddler was sick, or she needed to take the dog to the vet, or her husband wanted something from a hardware shop that wasn't available in the hardware shop that she normally goes to. That's such a gendered stereotype to make, but you know what I mean? It's so intriguing.
Yeah, all those things. I love the data and looking through it and finding the details that seem off from what your norms are. That's really, really great.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about dogs in transit. I'm super excited about this. So as you probably know from our Monday show, we have a segment called Puppies and Butterflies, which is the last part of our show. So obviously I'm a fan of dogs. But in Sydney, they're not allowed on public transport. Why is that?
Oh, great question. Well, I mean, there's lots of theories about it. From a practical perspective, they're not allowed just because there's a regulation that states that dogs are prohibited from using our train service, and dogs can use buses at the discretion of the bus driver, but they need to be in a carrier, which ostensibly acts as a prohibition because A, the bus driver can easily refuse, and B, if you've got a dog that's too big to carry, you're in real trouble. So from a practical perspective, that's why dogs aren't allowed to ride our public transport system. Why that regulation is in place, from the perspective of the operator, they raise a lot of barriers around cleanliness and the additional load on the system. It's a fairly historical thing, so dogs have never been allowed on public transport in Sydney from what we can tell. So it's a fairly ingrained and entrenched prohibition. But our sense is from our research that the real reason dogs are prohibited is because our system is very much focused around what we call clean, predictable trips. So the system in Sydney is very much around the journey to work and getting people in and out of the CBD. It's currently experiencing pre-COVID times, and then during the different waves that we've had in between those waves, massive overcrowding. So there's a huge demand for the use of public transport and not enough services to accommodate it. So what we've got is a system that is both not suited to the messiness of everyday life and a system that is at the brink and not able to accommodate any additional sort of trip load. And I think it's both those things that are making that prohibition stick and so hard to challenge.
Where did you get the idea for a clean trip? I mean, I think that's really interesting kind of phrasing as opposed to like messy trips, which are human trips, things that people do to maybe go to the store or take their kids to preschool or whatever it might be. I mean, we always think about with messy vitality. I mean, Robert Venturi and Jane Jacobs very famously talked about the messiness of cities, but I'm interested in that term, the terminology of a clean trip.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose Jacobs inspired the first use of it, but it was also inspired just by this research that we started to really look at what our transport system in Sydney was all about and realised that it's not about accommodating the complexity of modern life. It's about accommodating things that are really predictable. And I say clean because when I use the term, I think about people travelling to and from work wearing, the traditional business suit or something and not having any kind of mess about them, any kind of peripheral things like extra bags or children or dogs or anything else that is going to encumber that, direct trip to and from the CBD and the suburbs. And then, of course, the first time I used it, people just laughed because they thought about dogs and mess and smell, and that sort of made me think, oh my gosh, maybe I can't use that. But it's stuck from there.
I think it works. But you set out to do this research and found that dog owners make 2.4 million dog-related trips in a week in Sydney specifically. Where did you come up with that number, and what does that tell you about trips that are being made for pets in cars?
Yeah, well, the number, it's actually 2.4 million trips in cars. So there's a heap of other trips that are going on not in cars with dogs. And we got that number from originally, I started to do this research because I'm a qualitative researcher by trade, and I really wanted to sharpen my quantitative analysis skills. And to do that, I needed a data set to work on. And I found out pretty quickly that to get data from people, you ask them about their dogs because people always want to talk about their dogs. Interestingly, now I'm doing research on parents. No parents want to talk to me at all. dog owners just, they'll talk to me until the cows go home.
Really? That's surprising, actually. I'm surprised.
Oh no, it was really, I mean, when I first started to collect the data, I just used a scattergun approach of, went through Facebook groups and put notices up on dog parks and left postcards at vets and all sorts of other things. And pretty quickly I got a really good response rate. Well, not response rate because it's not a representative sample, but I got a good response. And I ended up with having the trip data from 1,200 dog owners. And I asked them about all the different types of trips that they do with their dogs. So I gave them a series of examples like trips to dog parks, trips to dog training, trips to go and visit family and friends, trips to walk dogs on a specific trail, that kind of thing. And then I asked about the different modes that people were using. And so that's how I came up with that figure. And at first we were astounded because there's a lot of research actually looking at the links between dog ownership and human health. And often they point to the fact that dog owners get more physical activity because they go and walk the dog. But that research never thinks about the fact that people actually might start that walking trip with a driving trip. They might actually drive somewhere and then walk the dog from there. So at first we were really, really interested in that. And then we looked deeper into the data, and it wasn't only, trips to go and walk the dog somewhere specific or take the dog to a specific dog park. It was more that people just liked taking their dog along to things. So they liked visiting family and friends or going to a cafe or going to a pub here in Australia with their dog. And that's what was generating all those trips. And so we were pretty astounded by that number of car trips. And that's when we started to look at, well, perhaps it's because they don't have an alternative. Perhaps part of these trips could be solved by allowing people to use public transport with their dogs.
I mean, a lot of dog owners will say that their dogs are like family. So for you, I imagine that's a very easy connection to make. So people taking their dogs to different places.
Yeah, and there is research saying that that's an increasingly popular phenomenon, that dogs are considered part of the family now, more than they ever used to be. There's sort of some interesting research that's done content analysis of dog names, and increasingly we're seeing a shift towards giving dogs names that are actually more like human names. So previously it was, Fido or Pooch or Spot or whatever. And now I don't know what, do you have a dog?
I don't. My parents have had like black labs since I was born, but I haven't had a dog on my own.
Oh, beautiful dog. Yeah, Labradors are gorgeous. Anyway, I've got a
Dachshund, they're wonderful.
And her name is Olive, which is the perfect example of, naming a dog the kind of name that you might give a child. And really, I will be happily admit she was my first baby for sure, and she knows it.
Uh-huh. It's so true. They know.
Yeah.
Well, many of those pet owners you've also found was that many of them would like to use transit, but they can't. When you did the survey, I know it's a survey, so you would get responses, but did you get a sense of their frustration that they couldn't use transit for some of those trips?
Yeah, we did. There were some open-ended questions where people could tell us stories about when they've been prevented from using public transport. And some of those stories were actually quite sad. So people were telling me about how they needed to get to the vet quickly, but they couldn't because they weren't able to use the bus that was literally just outside the front of their apartment, that they had to walk, a kilometre with a dog having a seizure, things like that. But there were other really interesting qualitative answers coming out where quite a few people had said that once they got a dog, they actually then went out, got a driver's license and bought a car purely because they needed to, or they wanted to travel around with that dog. And subsequent to that, so many people have told me that they maintain a second car because they like having the option to be able to take their dog places. So I think it sounds silly, but it's just one of those little examples of the things that are keeping us in our private cars and away from transitioning towards a less car dependent life.
That makes sense. I mean, for my parents, I mean, there's a dog car and a non-dog car,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's one that the dog's allowed in and one that the dog's not allowed in.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I can see where that's the case. And then I read some of those comments in your research paper. There was a little bit of sadness in there that they couldn't take their pets to the vet when they really needed to, even though, like you said, there was a transit stop right in front of their house that would have taken them directly there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even waited overnight when they fretted doing that because they didn't have access to a car.
Yeah.
And then also 20% of people you surveyed said they might even get rid of their cars if they were allowed back on transit, which was an interesting number to me as well.
Well, it's hard. I'm always a bit skeptical about stated preference surveys,
Yeah.
particularly in the context of a highly emotive sort of issue like this. But still, even the fact that people considered either getting rid of the car altogether or shedding one car from their family indicates that it's something, worth pursuing. There was another question in there that said that, would you change your travel behaviour at all? And there are a lot more respondents who said that they would perhaps travel less by private car, even if they still maintained their car. So, yeah, it's interesting.
I also saw that there were a lot of respondents that are like, nope, we're not changing anything.
Yeah. I mean, and that just points, I think, to the fact that in Sydney, there's a lot of areas that are really poorly served by transit, or we call it public transport. So it's a silly question for them because they don't have a public transport system to use.
Right. Yeah. I think that's the case for a lot of folks here too.
Mm-hmm.
And you also looked at the policies in different countries too. I mean, you looked at European countries mostly and the United States, but what did you find from looking at other countries and their policies about having dogs on public transport?
Yeah, we actually went into this in quite a bit of detail and wanted to look at some of the reasons why we thought that some countries did allow dogs on public transport and others didn't. But first of all, we found that there was actually quite a lot of sophistication to the policy mechanisms that are used. So it's not just a matter of saying, yep, you can have a dog on public transport, or no, you can't. You can actually really tailor the policy to suit some of the concerns that are in the society. So we looked at some of the reasons why some people were against having dogs on public transport, and huge concern about mess and smell, and then that sort of related to people who have dog allergies. But in countries where dogs are allowed on public transport, they're quite often limited to one specific train carriage or limited to one particular area of the bus. And there is always a caveat that says that if somebody is really having an objection or a dog is really causing an issue, that the public transport staff have the right to say, no, we're not going to carry your dog. There were other big concerns about having to clean up after the dog. And when we spoke to the public transport agency here in Sydney, that was one of their number one concerns, was what the cleaners would think about all of this. And interestingly, the problem with that from even the travelling public was not necessarily having to deal with the dog waste or whatever, but having to pay for that. They didn't want to have that cost lumped into their public transport ticket. But a lot of the countries where dogs are allowed, you have to buy a ticket for the dog. And some countries, like Zurich is my favourite, they actually have an annual pass for dogs that you can buy. And they can use that as a pricing mechanism to recount those costs if the costs do seem to escalate once dogs are allowed on the system. There were also a lot of policies that prevented dogs from travelling during peak hours, which is totally understandable. If a bus was crowded, for example, the dog would be refused. And always the policy stipulate that a dog needs to be on a lead and under the control of the owner at all times. So I guess what the message is, that it's not just a matter of a blanket prohibition or allowing the dogs. You can tailor the policy environment to really suit what's going on with the community that you're working with. And I think that's really important in terms of implementing a policy into a city where that policy doesn't exist already.
I think if I ever went to Zurich, which I hope I get to go to Zurich someday because of some of the research I've seen on some of the trams and things like that. But if I ever get to go, I think I might buy a dog pass. Even if I don't bring a dog, I might buy a dog pass just to have it. I mean, it seems like a collectible almost to have the doggy pass.
Oh, absolutely. And they've got two different types of passes. One of them is actually a paper pass. So I'd love one of those. I'd frame it. How exciting would that be?
That'd be pretty cool.
There's other really interesting mechanisms too, like Austria, for example. They maintain what's called forgive my German, a Listenhund, which is like a list of dog breeds that they deem need to actually have a license to be able to travel using the system. And if you don't have that license, you can't travel. What's interesting to me, though, is that license actually requires more of the dog owner than the dog. So it is a test for the dog owner to make sure that the dog owner understands what is responsible dog ownership. And I think that's a really important part of this puzzle, is making sure that people know what is expected of them when they're in public with their dogs. Because I think it's not that there's a lot of people out there who don't know, that they're supposed to clean up after their dogs, and that not everybody likes dogs, so that they need to keep the dog restrained, etc. It's more just that we need a way to allay the concerns of people who are worried about that. And by having that sort of policy layer where you can say, okay, so these people have passed a test that says that they're, really aware of what is expected with them when they're traveling in public with their dogs. That could be an important mechanism as well.
Yeah, and it seems, like I mentioned earlier, it seems very emotional for some folks too. I mean, from the responses that you got to one of your previous articles, it seems like a very hot topic and somewhat polarizing, it feels like.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's interesting how every time I publish something on this, I'm always asked by like the talkback radio stations to go on and talk. And sometimes I get crucified, which I just find not enjoyable, but it's still an interesting experience.
Right. Nobody enjoys getting crucified.
No, but it is. And that's been reflected in the research as well. There's research that just really proves there are dog people and there are not dog people. For whatever reason, dogs are a really polarizing issue. And as we're trying to provide a system that is public and publicly accessible and publicly enjoyable, we need to acknowledge that polarization, not just sort of plow ahead. And that's something I've enjoyed in doing this research, is coming at it from my personal perspective, where I'm obviously a dog person. I love dogs, I love companion animals, and I'm a true believer in the health benefits of companion animals, not only for me as an individual, but for society. And having to really put myself in the shoes of other people has been a really interesting experience. But it has made me reflect that urban planning, transport planning, that's what it is. It's trying to walk in other people's shoes and see things from the perspective of others. So it's been a great experience for me to do this research as well.
Going back to some of those regulations from other countries, yeah, I think it was somewhere, was it Milan that has like a 2-dog limit? Maybe it was something like that. And then Paris has the rule where you have to have them in some sort of a container or some sort of a sack or satchel. And I've seen those Instagram posts where somebody tries to fit their golden retriever into like an IKEA bag so that they can go on Paris transport. It's quite hilarious, I must say, that they're trying to fit the dogs onto the train or the bus.
Yeah, I think that was actually the subway in New York. I think it was the IKEA bag one. I mean, maybe it was replicated in Paris. But the funny thing is about Paris is that, with applying the best of my French and then referring to people who are native French speakers, the actual regulation stipulates that it's a basket test. So if you can fit the dog in a basket, it has no definition subsequent to that of what a basket is.
Yeah, they don't tell you what the basket is.
No. And it's like, it doesn't say sort of dog carrier or appropriate carriage. It just says basket, which I just found that quite quaint and hilarious.
Now in Sydney, do you see people take the dogs on transport that are tiny, that are, it's like they'll bring them in a bag and then you'll see their heads popping out, and just to kind of like, because they know that they're not allowed, but they're kind of sneaking them on?
No, look, you don't generally see it on the train. I mean, I'm sure that it happens, but people take the regulation on the train, on the rail network, really quite seriously, and you don't see dogs on the train very much at all. On the buses, because they are actually permitted, if, a little dog in a bag, so you see it every now and again, and I've seen quite a few cats on buses as well, obviously being carried to the vet. Yeah, but people don't flaunt the regulations, which is interesting for Australia, because usually we're pretty happy to push the boundaries of things like that.
Is that a national pastime?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's That's another piece of research that we did where we applied what's called the Hofstede dimensions of national culture to countries that prohibit and allow dogs on public transport. So these Hofstede dimensions haven't been used that much in transport, but I think they could be really useful. It's 6 different indices of national culture that have been developed mainly for marketing purposes, I think, through a rolling survey of people around the world. And one of those indices is actually power distance or respect for authority. And Australia ranks really low on that. Which I mean, one of the things that I think would be really interesting to apply it to is the rollout of bike sharing programs. I don't know. I know you guys have got scooters over there in San Francisco.
Yeah, we have bike share, we have scooters, we've had everything just because all the tech companies like to use this as a test bed for everything. So we've had it all.
Which is both good and bad. In Australia anyway, bike sharing it was a debacle. We just are hopeless at sharing stuff and respecting other people's property. Like bikes ended up in rivers and up trees and all over the place. It's like
we had that here too.
Did you?
Yeah, certain cities had a lot more, but I think, you always see kind of decapitated bikes or things that are a little bit less taken care of. But I remember Dallas specifically. I think Dallas had some problems with people throwing the bikes in the river and things like that. So it's not uncommon here to have that happen.
But you can't imagine that happening in Copenhagen or, even Berlin, or it's just such a different cultural appreciation for artifacts of transport, bikes in particular, and other people's property. Amazing.
Yeah. Well, what's your big takeaway from this research about automobility overall? Is there something that you took away from this research and your research on families from just kind of general automobility and how it's kind of taken over?
I think it's that need to just look beyond travel itself as determining transport behaviour. I call it looking sideways from the car. We've got to look at what people are using the car for. We've got to have a more nuanced and a deeper appreciation for that if we're really going to figure out how to get people out of cars. I think that's, the key takeaway is that whole idea of transport as a metaphor. Transport is a metaphor for all the other things that we do in our lives. Dogs are just one of those things. Children, shopping, all the messiness that makes up modern life is what transport is accommodating. And if we don't have an understanding of that, or at least an appreciation of it, then we're really going to continue struggling, trying to encourage people to use alternative ways of travelling to make their lives work. That's the key thing. The other key message, I think, is if you ever want to attract a lot of survey participants, start asking people about their dogs.
Apparently they respond, not children, but dogs.
Not children, dogs. It's all about the dogs.
Well, as a dog fan, I guess I can see why people always want to talk about their little buddies. I think it's so fun. I hope at some point you can get a dog. We'll see. Where can folks find the research online if they want to get a hold of it or get a hold of you?
If you just search for Jennifer L. Kent at the University of Sydney, my Google Scholar profile will come up and all the articles are there. Otherwise, they can follow me on Twitter, which is Jennifer Lee Kent, at Jennifer Lee Kent.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Jennifer Kent, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been really interesting. I really appreciate it.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.